Hmm.
Hi, Carson. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining. I think we'll get started here a few minutes after the hour just to allow people to join. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just waiting a few more minutes for folks to join. We'll probably get started in about 2 minutes. But in the meantime, if you want to share your name and organization, and if you have any labor market related questions, you pop those in the chat. Yeah, hopefully I can get to all of them. Thanks for joining us. Okay, my clock says 12:02, and if you've ever seen one of my presentations before, you know that I try to put too much information into an hour, so I'm not going to waste too much more time and get right into it. Thank you for joining this afternoon. As you may see in the chat, folks are sharing their name and organization, so if you have a chance to do that, I would appreciate it, just so I know who's here. It kind of helps with the context. But what we plan on doing today is just doing an overview of Northeast Minnesota. So for those of you unfamiliar with Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development's planning regions, Northeast Minnesota in this context includes Aiken, Carlton, Cook, Lake, Itasca, Koochiching, and St. Louis counties, so the 7-county Arrowhead region. So when I say Northeast Minnesota, that is what I'm referring to unless I specify otherwise. My name is Carson Gorecki. I am a regional labor market analyst for the state of Minnesota in the Department of Employment and Economic Development, also known as DEED. You may see that we will be recording this session, just a heads up, and I will make sure to share out a link to the video afterward too. Just appreciating that I'm covering a lot of material in pretty short amount of time, so you may want to go back and say, what was he talking about there? He was talking really fast and there were a lot of numbers. So you'll have the opportunity to revisit this later as I load it up on the web. The plan today is to start broadly with population and some demographic trends for the region, which usually inform the labor force and the labor market characteristics as well. So I'll talk about how those two are related. Talk about some labor force trends, some unemployment rate trends, but then we'll dive into more of the jobs and employment by industry and occupations and some of the characteristics there, along with some wage trends. And then if we have time, we'll talk about some commuting patterns, some educational outcomes trends from our post-secondary, but also our high school graduates here in the region, as well as some occupations in demand. And I do plan on sticking around for a while after the hour. So if you do have any questions that I wasn't able to address, I'll stick around to talk with anybody that wants to stick around afterward. But if you do have any questions as I'm going, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try and address them as they come up, or if there's a good stopping, pausing point throughout, I will address them then. So thank you all for joining, and we'll get right into it. I mentioned that I'm a regional analyst for the state of Minnesota, indeed. There are 6 of us, and here we are. So if you are from outside the region, there is an analyst for your area as well. I will say that we have a great team. We love serving our customers. We love being responsive and answering questions. So please reach out to us. I'll put in some links and a follow-up email too, so you'll have all the information on how to contact these great folks. Labor market information. Each state has a labor market information office. There are some core resources that each LMI shop produces, including unemployment rates, labor force statistics. There's a couple of programs that we all cover that are related to the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics. But then there's things that each state can, do on their own and do uniquely. One example in Minnesota is our job vacancy survey. Not every state does that. They may have some different version of it, but that's unique to Minnesota. We like to think that LMI can help anybody, no matter what organization you're in, what sector or field, to make sound decisions. So whether you're a job seeker and you want to know which wage to kind of negotiate upon, or you're on the other side of the table and you're an employer and you want to know what the going rate is for that position to offer a competitive wage, we can help you out. Labor market information can help you out with that. It also can help in a broader sense. So if you're thinking about more strategic planning, really labor market information is socioeconomic data with a focus on the economy. So anything that has to do with the economy and involves people, I would say, is my definition of labor market information. So career exploration is a big one. I go in and talk to high school students throughout the school year. And I learn a lot from them too about the expectations and how they're looking at the workforce and what they're expecting out of it. And that informs a lot of the information and how I present it. Wages is a huge one. I mentioned that already. Getting to know who your community and workforce is or are. So, let's say the workforce for healthcare and social assistance looks very different than, say, the workforce for construction. And knowing what your typical worker is, where they're coming from, can be super important in how you reach out, how you're recruiting, et cetera. Policy making, A lot of this information goes into crafting policy and writing grants. And I mentioned strategic planning, but really it's a great way to have a reality check. There's a lot of perceptions on what our economy is doing or what our labor market is doing. And we have a whole array of resources that can help check that perception against reality. All right, starting broadly with population. The Northeast region has seen some growth over the last 5 years. Not huge growth, so about 1,000 people since 2020 through 2025. But that includes over the last 3 years small declines each of the past 3 years, so 2023, 24, 25. The growth was really concentrated in a couple of counties, Aiken, Carlton, and Itasca, but also the city of Duluth, while Cook, Lake, and Couchiching declined over those 5 years. Almost all of that growth, that population growth, happened in 2022. It was a little bit flat in 2023, and then again, those losses the last couple of years. If we compare to the rest of the state, we are growing more slowly. So we grew about 0.3% over those 5 years. Meanwhile, the state as a whole grew 2.2%. The fastest growing region in the state was central Minnesota. So if you think like north and northwest of the Twin Cities metro, that area, expanding exurbs from the Twin Cities, that grew about 5.4%. And the only region to grow slower than Northeast Minnesota was Southwest Minnesota. How has that population changed? So what's behind that population change? We talk about this in terms of components of population change, and the different components in a broad sense are immigration or migration, so people moving in and out of the region, and then natural change. Natural change consists of deaths and births. So births on the positive side of the ledger and deaths on the negative side, you put those together, that's the natural change. And then in migration versus out migration, and how is that net migration adding into the equation? You add it all together, we had about 1,000 more deaths than births over the last several years. So without any in migration, we would just be trending negative about 1,000 people per year. But we have had positive net migration, which has been slightly more than that 1,000 on average over the last 5 years. And if you look at this chart here, you could see the different components. So the purple is the deaths over the last 5-6 years. The green represents the births, so that's the natural change piece. And then the migration is broken out into domestic, the orange chunk of the bars, and then a very small sliver is international migration. International migration is a relatively small component in a net sense over the last couple of years, and you can see it's been diminishing since 2022. That was really when our population growth peaked, but it has been on the decline since then, as has domestic migration with a little bump into 2025. A little more on our population. We are older than average. You may have heard that before. It is true. The median age for Northeast Minnesota is 48.6 years, and that is about a decade older than the state as a whole. The median age for the state was 38.8 as of 2025, so about a decade difference between the two. In some ways, that means we're about a decade ahead in some of these aging trends and how that impacts the workforce. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. 23% of our population is 65 or older, and that's a pretty significant chunk when you think about the typical retirement age being around that age. People become less and less engaged in the workforce, and then there's less and less people that are available to work or willing to work as they age out. At the same time, we've had declines in the under 25, so the emerging workforce, and our core workforce, or part of the core workforce, the 35 to 54 age groups over the last decade, 2 decades. Meanwhile, the fastest growth in an age sense has been in that 55 to 74 age cohort, which grew about 56%. So we think about in terms of numbers, that's a 33,000 additional 55 to 74-year-olds. And at the same time, we lost about 22,000 35 to 44. Some of those aged into that 55 age group. And that we also have 11,000 fewer under 25-year-olds in our region. And that has some ramifications as well as we talk about the, again, emerging workforce. At the same time, our population is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. Slowly, it's a rather small relative share of our population compared to the rest of the state. You can see just over 10% of our population is of color. You compare that to the state, we're about 23%. So less diverse when you compare to the rest of the state, but the population of color grew about 32% over the last decade, while at the same time, the white population was relatively flat. The foreign-born population, another component, relatively small. It's about 5,800 people, and that actually declined about 1.8% over the last decade, so 2014 through 2024. At the same time, statewide, that foreign-born population grew 6.7%. So folks are coming to Minnesota, moving here from other countries. They are settling, for the most part, in other regions of the state. Okay, I'll pause here for a sec to look at, see if you have any questions. Yeah, we'll get to those, Donald. That'll be when we break it out into industry and occupational data. But thank you for the question. But any questions on the population or demographic section before I dive into more of the labor force? All right, we'll keep it going. Okay, so labor force, when I say labor force, I'm referring to folks that are either employed, so actively in jobs, or not employed or unemployed and actively looking for work. So it's folks that we say are engaged in the workforce, either through looking for work or through employment. So those people we have added to the labor force over the last 4 years into 2025. So on an annual sense, you can see how the blue bar line there has grown over the last 4 years. So that's a positive thing. We actually got really close to re-achieving our pre-pandemic labor force levels. The unemployment rate at the same time has grown over the last several years. And we had record low unemployment. You can see in 2022, that 3.4%, and how that compares the gray bars to the historical trend. We saw lowering unemployment basically since the peak of the Great Recession. Of course, you had the exception of the COVID pandemic in 2022, so we had a spike, but the long-term trend has been lowering unemployment. And really what that means is that the economy is more efficiently utilizing the labor that's available, the workers that are looking for work. At the same time, the labor force has been shrinking. So there's been fewer folks that have been available to be taking those jobs. So those dynamics have been happening at the same time. So we have had the highest unemployment rate in the last 5 years, and more if you take out the 2020 rate of 7.7%. You can see how we compare to pre-pandemic, about in line. Compared to the state, the unemployment rate in April was about 4.5%. So you can see how that compares. Of course, there's some seasonal fluctuation. This is how the unemployment rate in April varied across the state, both by workforce service areas on the left and then counties. We have 2 workforce service areas in Northeast Minnesota. It's essentially the city of Duluth and then everything else. And you can see that the unemployment rate for everything else, or workforce service area 3, as we call it, was a bit higher, the highest in the state for all workforce service areas, and Duluth was actually quite a bit lower. That's an interesting dynamic to have in the region. The April rate was 5.3%, and this is where that growth that we saw in the labor force and the overall kind of decline in unemployment over the last several years, or at least compared to pre-pandemic, we're starting to see that shift. Over the year into April, the labor force actually fell by 3,000 people in the region. That's a big change from the trends we had seen before. And employment also was down even more so, about 2.4% or 3,700. What does that look like in a line chart? It looks like that. So you can see that the ups and downs of the seasonality, so general growth, until we reach the end of 2025. And then we start to almost drop off a cliff there. You can see that the the labor force and employment in the orange lines really started to decline into 2026. There's a gap there because we didn't collect, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics did not collect data in October of 2025, so that's why there's a little gap. But you can see the unemployment rate also growing over that period. All right, a little bit on the labor force itself. So how does that stack up in terms of age, race, education, ethnicity, etc.? The big takeaway here is that Northeast Minnesota has a relatively low labor force participation rate. So that is the share of folks that are basically eligible to be working, that are either working or looking for work. And for Northeast Minnesota, on a 5-year average through 2024, that was 59%. And you can see how that compares to Minnesota overall. It's about 10% lower, about 9% lower. And that's a significant gap. And when we look at the workforce service areas, Northeast Minnesota outside of Duluth actually had the lowest labor force participation rate among all those workforce service areas as well. Within the region, there are some disparities by labor force participation, the largest being for our oldest workers and our youngest workers. But also Black, Indigenous, and workers with disabilities. That's where the labor force participation is the lowest within the region. So comparing to other people within the region or other workers within the region. If we compare to the state, we also have some larger disparities. The biggest, again, being for our Black or African American workers, our 65 to 74-year-old workers, so just past the typical retirement age. Are workers with less than a high school degree, which is a relatively small share of the labor force, but still a pretty big difference between our labor force participation rate for that group relative to the states. And then again, Indigenous workers. In terms of our share of labor force, we have relatively more Indigenous workers, 20 to 24-year-olds. That reflects the presence of our post-secondary institutions. So we have more 20 to 24-year-old workers because of that. Our 75-plus-year-olds, we have an older population, so we're more likely to have some older workers, even with lower labor force participation for those groups. We just have more of them, so the odds that we have a higher share in the labor force is higher. And we also have more workers that are veterans and workers with disabilities. Least concentrated, so relative to the state, are workers of color other than those Indigenous workers, those with less than a high school degree, and then the 25 to 44-year-old workers, which is our core prime age workforce. And that's, you can see there the breakdown by education, but also veteran status and disability status. You can see 47% for those with disabilities is one of the lowest rates outside of the ages. We also track unemployment insurance claims. So UI claims, we track both initial claims, so those are the first claims that folks file, and then we have regular continued claims, which are subsequent claims in subsequent weeks. Regular claims were up the last 2 years into 2025 on an annual basis, and you can see how it compares to pre-pandemic. We're a little bit higher than we were compared to pre-pandemic levels, so more claims. And these are the initial and regular, initial being the blue line, dotted line, and then the orange are the regular continued claims. By industry, annual claims are up for mining. That's no surprise. We had layoffs in 2025, big increase in terms of initial claims initially, but then also regular continued claims as those miners remained laid off. Management, transportation and warehousing, and public administration as well. Public administration is essentially all government workers, local, state, and federal. Breaking it out by demographic, you could see how annual claims for mining, I mentioned that already, but by age, we had under 22 with the smallest increase by age, but then 65 and over, the bigger increase of claims into 2025. Those increases continued for that 65 plus age group into 2025 to 2026 through April, our most recent month of data. And that 65 older age group, actually group period, was the only one we saw increases in claims. You can see the blue bars there on the right. That refers to a decline for all of those regular claims by age group, but then also by educational attainment toward the bottom. When we look at those claims in April, initial claims were up for educational services over the year, manufacturing, management, and accommodation food services. So kind of a wide variety of different sectors. And then when we look at regular claims, mining, I mentioned already, still up over the year. Healthcare, accommodation, food services, manufacturing, and retail. It's kind of a representation of some of the core sectors in the region. But even with those sectors seeing increases in regular claims are still down in April 15% over the year compared to 2025 April. And initial claims are down 11%. And those claims are down more even than the state saw claims down for both regular and initial over that period. Probably heard in the news or read that college grads, especially recent college grads, are having a harder time in their job search or entering the workforce. We do have some data that seem to hint at that. We have unemployment rates by educational attainment. This doesn't break out college grads by whether they're new or old, but we do see some notable movement recently in the unemployment rate, 12-month rolling average unemployment rate for college grads. You can see the purple line in the chart here, a notable increase over the last 6-7 months. The largest relative growth there, up about 46% over the year. It was up 34% for all workers. It was also up above average for those with just a high school degree, 16%, so lower than average, and it went down for those with less than a high school degree, which again is a rather small share of all folks. And this is for the state as a whole. So we don't have these data for Northeast Minnesota, at least yet, but I imagine that we'll see something similar when we do get information more locally. All right, we also have a job seeker experience survey. So we interview those that work, so job counselors that work with job seekers. And we've been conducting this survey twice a year for about 1.5 years now. So we have a couple versions of it. And we ask those job counselors whether the job seekers that they're working with are generally finding it harder or easier. So like things we can compare over time, trying to build a longitudinal story here that we can kind of add some qualitative information to these data that I've been sharing. And this most recent round was completed in early 2026. Nearly 63% of the career force staff and partners who responded in that 2026 version said it was harder than a year ago for their job seeking customers to find work. So we're seeing increased difficulty, and that is up from 59% in the last job search experience survey, which was in the middle of 2025. And you can see how Northeast compares to the rest of the states. So Northeast is on the top versus the state as a whole. We're about the same in terms of the share saying it's about the same, somewhat harder, and much harder relative to the state. We also ask, what is the most common benefit that job seekers you are working with are seeking after wages? Because wages is almost always number one for folks. So when we ask that, there's a little bit of difference between Northeast Minnesota and the state as a whole. Health insurance was more top of mind for the job seekers that folks in our region are working with. Flexible scheduling is up there. Telework and remote options is something that has grown a lot recently. I know there's a lot of information and interest in that. And then job security. But you can see the different options there and how we're asking about it. If you are interested in this, I'll send a link to the article that is analyzing the latest round. There's a lot of great, there's a dashboard in there that gives the open-ended answers as well. So you can get some great some great color to the answers behind these numbers. I mentioned we ask whether it's easier or harder, but then broken out by types of jobs. So which ones are considerably easier for job seekers to be finding according to these job counselors? Food service, healthcare support, no occupations are considerably easier. Cleaning and maintenance, drivers and movers. So a lot of these are jobs or categories of jobs that require less education and training to get into, have lower wages on average. And then when we look at those that are considerably harder, at the top, IT and math experts, managers and leaders, creative professionals, business and finance, very different kind of share of occupations towards the top that it's more difficult to find. The IT and math, that really does reflect that larger narrative that you see in maybe the national news about artificial intelligence, but also remote work being an impediment, especially to the new graduates that are trained in IT and math and computer science. Okay, jumping into employment trends a little bit more. This is the annual average number of jobs in Northeast Minnesota, the purple line there, and then the two different workforce service areas I mentioned earlier. So you have Duluth, which is the blue on the bottom, and then the rest of Northeast Minnesota, call it Workforce Service Area 3 or Workforce Development Board 3, Northeast Minnesota. Those two will sum up to the purple line. You can see this largely kind of tracks with the population growth too. We've seen in the last 5-6 years, and we've seen growth in employment, but the growth in employment has been relatively modest. We have not regained that pre-pandemic employment levels. And indeed, we actually saw our first decline in employment over the year into 2025. We lost about 730 jobs over the year. And remain about 3,800 jobs lower than where we were in 2019. So that's a decline of about 2.7%. At the same time, the state, which is the gray bars there, reached the 2019 levels in late 2023. So you can see that employment recovery happened a lot more rapidly and fully statewide than it did in Northeast Minnesota. And then in Duluth, actually added jobs over the year, about 120, but it's still about 2,500 jobs lower than in 2019. That's even a larger percentage drop, 4.2%, than the region as a whole. So then if you look at Northeast Minnesota, down 850 jobs over the year, but only down 1,400 or 1.6% from 2019. So over the longer run, fared a little bit better than the city of Duluth. And over that same period, just so you have the numbers to compare at the state level, the state is up 41,500 jobs compared to 2019, which is a growth of 1.4%. Breaking that out a little bit by sector, healthcare is a very important sector to the region. We're at the point now where it's about 1 out of every 4 jobs in the region, and even more so for Northeast Minnesota, or for Duluth. That sector grew 1.8% over the year. At the same time, I mentioned this with the unemployment claims. Mining was down about 277 jobs over the year, about 6.6%. So that's the largest decline. No surprise with those layoffs. Also down over the year, other services. And if you're wondering like what other services is, it is kind of a catch-all, but it includes laundry, personal care, so like salons, death care services, veterinary care, things like that. Those were down over the year, as was admin support and waste management services, which also lost about 200 jobs. The most jobs were added, kind of reflecting that growth in healthcare and hospitals, nursing facilities, but then also miscellaneous manufacturing added a fair amount of jobs over the year. Miscellaneous manufacturing, plastics, rubber manufacturing, were all kind of bright spots. As was the administration of housing, urban planning, and community development, which is kind of a mouthful for specific government programs. electronic product manufacturing also grew, and mining, administration and support services, heavy and civil engineering construction, and motor vehicle and parts dealers were the ones to lose the most jobs over the year. Wages were up over the year into 2025, about 3.6%. Those are average wages. So we saw growth across a lot of the sectors. This chart here shows the size of the box is the share of jobs by sector. The darker red it is, the more concentrated those sectors or those jobs are relative to the state. So you can see mining is by far the most concentrated sector in the region. We have actually relatively low concentration in manufacturing, but manufacturing is still the 6th largest sector in the region. Utilities is the 2nd most concentrated, and then healthcare and social assistance is more concentrated than average, and that is a real regional advantage because it is such an important sector and does pay above average wages. Okay, switching from industry, which is kind of what the businesses do, to the occupation, which is what the individual worker does. This is via our Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics program. These data were released at the beginning of this year, and the median wage for Northeast Minnesota just passed $50,000 a year threshold, which equates to about $24.45 an hour. That is equivalent to about 87% of the statewide median. So you can see like where our wages compare. There is quite a bit of variation across the state in terms of median wages. If we compare that to, we have an estimate of basic needs cost of living. So not having savings, not going out to eat or a lot of the like leisure expenses, but basic needs of food, transportation, housing, childcare if you have children, taxes, clothing, those kind of basic needs. So factoring that in, we estimate that the basic needs cost of living threshold for a single individual in Northeast Minnesota with no kids is equivalent to about $18.45 as of last year, or about $38,000. For the typical family, as we call it, which is 2 working adults, 1 working full-time, 1 working part-time with 1 child. So you have some childcare expenses there. So 60 hours a week, averaging it, they would need to make on average $23, about $24 an hour, or about 74. And you could see how if someone was making the median wage, or both workers were making the median wage working on an average of 60 hours a week, the wiggle room there is not a ton between the median wage and the typical estimated cost of living. Oh, I will say that the cost of living for Northeast Minnesota is 84%. So you do get a little bit more relative to the state. You do get a little bit more for your buck in Northeast Minnesota relative to the state, according to Deed. A little bit more on the occupational employment and wage statistics. Our highest paying occupations, management, legal, architecture, engineering, healthcare practitioners, and technical. So like physicians, advanced practice practitioners. Those kind of jobs kind of reflect the high education and training that go into them. On the other end of the spectrum, the lowest paying food prep and serving related, sales, personal care and service, building grounds, cleaning and maintenance jobs. Just to give you kind of a figure, management, which was the highest paying, $48.29 was the median wage for those management positions. Healthcare practitioners followed behind with $44 an hour median. And then if we look at some of those lower ones, food prep and serving related averaged $15 an hour. That was the lowest. Sales and related was at $17 an hour. Where do we pay more relative to the state? So on the previous slide, I showed you that on average, our median wage is 87% of the state. So on average, a lot of our occupations pay less relative to those statewide occupations, but we do have some jobs and some occupational groups that do pay more, even on an absolute basis. And those are construction and extraction. That's not surprising. We have the mining jobs that are more concentrated here that tend to be really high paying. Farming, fishing, and forestry. Not so much that first F, but those last two, fishing and forestry, those are more concentrated in Northeast Minnesota. We think about forestry and those related industries tend to be more concentrated and specialized in our region. And then production, that's largely manufacturing jobs, and the manufacturing jobs that we have tend to pay a little bit higher wages. We think about transportation manufacturing being one big example of that. Installation, maintenance, and repair, that reflects, again, the concentration of mining, because those occupations also are either in mining or serve in an ancillary role. I didn't even mention the chart. The chart is reflecting concentration of those different occupational groups. So you can see that we do have a higher concentration of farming, fishing, and forestry jobs. Again, not necessarily farming. We don't have a lot of the traditional crop agriculture or animal agriculture relative to the state. Construction and extraction, that's reflecting mining. We do have a slightly higher share of just straight up construction jobs as well. Community and social service, installation, maintenance, and repair, again, related to mining. Protective service, we do have more than our fair share of prisons or related institutions, so that is reflected in protective service. And then least concentrated, computer and mathematical, legal, business and financial operations, production, reflecting manufacturing, and then arts, entertainment, and design and sports. Which occupations are in demand? We have a measure that brings in different factors. So unemployment insurance claims, how many jobs there are, how are they expected to change over time? And then we bring in some local knowledge to kind of check these numbers, and we come up with a list of occupations in demand on a 1 to 5 star ranking, with 5 stars being the highest. There is a strong presence, probably not a surprise, of occupations in the healthcare field, but also food prep and serving, and office and admin. Those three tend to be the highest or the largest employing occupational groups in the region. So it's not super surprising that they have a strong presence among the highest occupations in demand. Healthcare careers across the education and training spectrum too. So it's not the case where all of the very highly trained, highly educated jobs are the ones that are in demand. You see anywhere from home health care and personal care aides, which can require high school or less, to nursing assistants and vocational training, to registered nurses, which typically require an associate degree, all the way up to pharmacists and physicians. So healthcare is really well represented. Construction and extraction and production, those occupations in demand here stand out because they pay quite a bit above the average wages, even among the peers in the occupations in demand. Commuting patterns. This is always of interest to me as a person who studied geography. Love to see how and where workers are living, and how far they're driving or not driving, and how that's changing over time. The Census Bureau's On the Map tool is really useful for this. One of the shortcomings of it is that it's a few years old, so the most recent data we have here are for 2023. But thankfully, these patterns, other than over COVID, when a lot of people started working from home immediately overnight, do not change super rapidly. But some big takeaways from this, about 78% of the folks that are working in the region also live in the region. So, it's a pretty self-contained region when we think about commuting. For those that are commuting in, the primary source of workers, Douglas County, Wisconsin, not surprising, Superior across the border, but also Hennepin, Crow Wing, Pine, and other metro counties. Hennepin, I will say, I don't think these people are physically commuting, like driving up. There may be a few of those folks that do that on a regular basis or on a more seldomly. I think that's more representative of folks that live in Hennepin County, but their employer is located in the region. So that is another one of the things that you have to think about in these data, which is it's not necessarily saying these people are getting up and driving between these 2 points every day. It's just that this is where they live and this is where they work. And we do know that remote work is rose in incidence since the pandemic. So I think that that is more reflective of that type of scenario than it is of folks actually literally commuting from Hennepin County to, say, Duluth. Primary counties for those that are commuting out, that's why I put the quotes in there now. Hennepin, so again, unlikely that folks are driving from Duluth to Hennepin every day. Douglas County, more likely that that is a physical commute, and then Ramsey County. So we do have a fair share of folks, and I do think that is evidence that there is more remote work happening in the region. And then from another data source, the American Community Survey, we know that 11% of folks are working from home primarily, and that is more than double the pre-pandemic share. So we did see pretty strong growth in that, but it did level out as we have seen the return to work efforts be pushed more in the last couple of years. Okay, we are getting to all the fun stuff I wasn't sure I was going to get to, so this is great. We have a data source between the Minnesota Department of Education, MDE, and DEED. The statewide longitudinal education data system, or SLEDS, lets us know what our high school graduates are doing. Is super handy for folks like us that are studying the emerging workforce, and we want to know where those high school graduates are going and what they're doing after graduation. For the 2024 graduation year, we know that 53% of our local high school grads enrolled in college. So that share that has been enrolling in college has been declining for a long time now, since 2009, which, 2009. So we could see the share, or actually the number of folks that were enrolling in college. So we have seen a declining share of high school graduates overall. So that is also reflected in this. But the share that have been enrolling in college also has been dropping over the years, but has stabilized, say, the last 3 or 4 years. At the same time, those that opted to be employed right away has been growing. So that'd be that yellow line there. So there's more high school grads that saw rising wages, increased opportunity in a tight labor market as we came out of the pandemic, and took advantage of it. And they ended up employed most often in leisure and hospitality, which is a traditional place for young workers to land. Hospitality, working in restaurants, bars, hotels, etc. Transportation, warehousing, and utilities is one that has grown recently. Transportation, you can think of like if they're driving for Uber or Lyft, they would be in the transportation and warehousing sector, or if they're doing like DoorDash and things like that. So I think that is more common in showing up in the data as well. And then more than half of the grads that are enrolling in college do stay local. So the most common landing spots or schools for graduates here in Northeast Minnesota. Minnesota North College is the top destination, which is great. Lake Superior number 2. So our local community college system is attractive to our graduates, and that's good. That's what we want. But so are University of Minnesota Duluth, UMNTC, but then College of St. Scholastica, Fond du Lac, Tribal and Community College. So the 5 schools within our region are in the top 6, 7 destinations here for our high school graduates. So that's great. That means that our local post-secondary system is attracting local grads. Related to this, for young workers, the wages for 19 and under workers were up 47% over the last 6 years. So from 2019 to 2025, 47%. But we're up even more, 48% for 20 to 24-year-olds. And 34% for all ages. So you can see the wages grew most rapidly for those young workers. And I think that is informing a lot of that increase in those high school students that are deciding to go be employed right away after graduation. And of the 3,100 or so high school grads in the region in 2024, about 1,700 enrolled in college, and about 920 of those enrolled in schools in the region, and that counts UWS or UW Superior. So more than half decided to stay local. Okay, and what about the post-secondary outcomes? So we have graduate employment outcomes, or GEO data, which allows us to see for all of the students that attended school in Minnesota, but then also were employed in Minnesota or continued their education in Minnesota, we're able to see where they worked, how much they got paid 2 years plus after graduation, whether they continued their education in Minnesota, but then also what industry and what region they were employed in. So some really rich data here to see, okay, we have all these grads, we have this great post-secondary system in Northeast Minnesota. What kind of graduates are we producing? How does that align with our demand in the region? This has kind of been a topic of interest of me for the last couple of years, kind of this workforce alignment question. And we have some great data to really analyze this. So looking at 2023 graduation years, University of Minnesota Duluth, we had about 2,000 total graduates. 80% of those were employed in Minnesota 2 years later. What about that other 20%? Some of them might continue education, some might be employed outside of Minnesota, or employed by, I think there's some other caveats there, like maybe federal government doesn't count to that as well. So 80% is probably higher than what it actually shows there. What is the median wage for those that are employed 2 years post-graduation? About $26.43 an hour. And then what are those top majors that are producing the most graduates? Psychology, biology, and mechanical engineering. Industry that they end up in kind of reflects this: professional and technical services. That especially is connected to the engineering programs at UMD. But then healthcare, biggest industry locally or sector locally, big draw. So that is not surprising to see that the second highest be there. And then what are the top regions of employment? So where are they going to be employed in Minnesota? Twin Cities actually attracts most UMD graduates. That also is not super surprising, given that a lot of the folks that go to UMD come from Twin Cities or elsewhere in the state. So the fact that they go get employment either back where they came from or elsewhere is not super surprising. We, of course, would love to retain more of them here in our workforce, but 24%, a fourth of them, do decide to stay and be employed in Northeast Minnesota. You see some similar numbers for St. Scholastica. The wages are a little bit higher, reflecting their concentration in these graduate programs. So registered nursing, nursing administration, physical therapy. Healthcare is by and large where a lot of the graduates at CSS end up. 55% ended up in healthcare 2 years later. Education being the second largest draw. Twin Cities is still the biggest destination in terms of a region, but Northeast accounts for a higher share. Minnesota North, we have to update the data on here, but about 970 grads. The biggest majors producing there, we know that liberal arts and sciences, general studies and humanities, that's one program, 328, so that's the largest. And a lot of those students are getting generals and then planning to transfer to other more four-year schools. Practical nursing and vocational and nursing assistants is the next largest. So healthcare is a big draw again for Minnesota North. And you can see that for Lake Superior College and Fond du Lac Tribal, healthcare is number one for those schools as well. But those schools have a much stronger connection locally. So you can see that of the graduates 2 years later, 70% from both of those schools end up employed in Northeast Minnesota. So those community colleges have a higher share of those graduates that end up in the region. A lot of that has to do with those students were living in the region already. Their plan was to, just get more education and training and then enter the workforce and have a higher earning potential. And that appears to be what is happening for those institutions. All right, so we got a few minutes left. Summarize here, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. We talked about population, how that growth has slowed quite a bit, largely reflecting the slowing of in-migration. The labor force at the same time, that growth that had been occurring those several years coming out of the pandemic appears to now have slowed and even reversed in the last couple of months. Participation and unemployment disparities, those have existed for a while relative to the state, but then also within groups in the region. Healthcare and manufacturing have shown true strength recently in terms of sectors, industry sectors, both in terms of employment and wage growth. On the other side of the spectrum, mining, the layoffs dragged employment there. Other services, admin support, and others have also weathered losses. Wages are competitive in some key occupational groups and industries where we have higher concentration, like mining, construction, and extraction. So we have some competitive advantages there. And our post-secondary institutions remain really strong workforce and economic development assets and engines. So tracking where those graduates are going and how they connect with local employers and local industries is going to be something that we'll keep an eye on. Yeah, thank you for your time this morning over lunch. Give you back 7 minutes if you want it. Otherwise, I'll stick around and answer any questions that you have. Thank you for your time today and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.